Hello, this is again Dr. Jonathan Bentovish, and I'm recording another video, very important video actually. This is following God's Physics recently published book, A New Scientific Paradigm for the 21st Century by iUniverse.com. And today's presentation is very important. It's a very special day. This is a special date for the Chabad Chassidut, Yutet Kislev. It's considered to be the head of the year for Chassidut Chabad, and it also is connected with the Alter Rebbe's redemption. But this is an important day today to speak about. The topic of today's presentation is the new God's physics scientific paradigm. It's time for Geulah. And Geulah is a term that is borrowed from the Hasidic tradition, the Jewish Hasidic tradition, and it signifies essentially a perfected moral, spiritual, and even physical state of the world towards which the world and the universe is evolving. And in fact, what I want to speak about today is because of this holy day, I want to speak about the scientific revolution that we were referring to that's taking place as we speak in physics, in theoretical physics, in 21st century physics and science more generally. We're actually standing at a point that may be regarded and should be regarded as equivalent to Einstein's major paradigmatic shift or scientific revolution of 100 years ago in 1919. As we all know, Einstein's general theory of relativity was validated by Eddington's famous 1919 solar eclipse expedition, and Eddington verified or validated empirically one of the critical predictions of Einstein's unique critical prediction for general relativity theory. And as I explained in previous presentations, I'm going to allude to it briefly. Science advances by leaps and bounds. Science is not a static, constant reality, as any human endeavor, as Thomas Kuhn, the famous philosopher of science, taught us. Science as a human endeavor evolves, and it may be said to evolve in a spiral manner in which we have a standard paradigm in which for a given scientific paradigm that works for a certain while, and after a while that standard paradigm, such as for example Newtonian classical mechanics standard paradigm in the 19th century, it holds for a while. It's useful for a while. I give the example of the metaphor. Imagine a person being born in a room and living their lives in a room. All they know of the world is that confined room. They get their clothes and food and all their needs within that room. So for them, the reality of the world is only that room. And then somebody knocks on the door, or maybe there is something knocking on the window, or perhaps there is some bolt piercing through the wall, and then that person starts realizing that there's something outside the room. The room is real, but it is real only as part of a broader reality. And that's essentially what Thomas Kuhn is telling us, and what Einstein essentially proved with his general relativity theory paradigmatic shift of 1919. That was verified in 1919, was discovered in 1950, and the special theory of relativity in 1905. But in any event, when Einstein's new paradigm for the 20th century physics appeared, first of all, it expanded the room, so to speak. The confined understanding of classical Newtonian mechanics expanded that understanding into a much broader reality of relativity theory, in which Newtonian mechanics was just a special case. And Thomas Kuhn is teaching us that science always evolves in that way. In other words, the standard paradigm of classical mechanics, of Newtonian mechanics, classical mechanics of the 19th century was good for a while, and it was useful. That was the room to discover the whole interior of that room. But then once we have some phenomena like things piercing through the wall, like inconsistencies within the room or within the pillars of the 19th century physics, in that case it was Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian electromagnetic theory, then Thomas Kuhn tells us that's a sign, a clear sign that we have to expand, open the door, and see that the room is placed, it's real, but it's placed within a house, and then the house within a neighborhood, and the neighborhood within a city, etc., etc. And so that's how science evolves. And as I was explaining in previous presentations, and also in this God's Physics book that was written for the layman reader, we stand at an equivalent point, and we stand at a very exciting point. And I'm actually quite excited today to deliver this video as I deliver many keynote opening talks of international physics conferences. There's been two now, a third special issue coming out in scientific articles, international scientific articles, and I have opened international conferences as a keynote opening talks, such as in the last Aerospace 2021 in Paris. In all of these presentations, and especially today with this very special day, which celebrates the discovery of the Hasidic thought, which in many regards, what science is discovering now is almost parallel or equivalent to what some of the truths and knowledge that has been discovered already 250 years ago, and even much earlier than that in Jewish thought. So it's a very exciting date, because in a sense where science is reaching right now, and that is the discovery of the Geulah. The topic of today's presentation is God's Physics New 21st Century Paradigm. It's time for Geulah. And so we're going to focus on explaining, in a sense, what this major discovery, this new God's Physics Paradigm, which I'm going to again indicate or mention the fact that we stand at a historic point where this new God's Physics Paradigm is accepted increasingly, and in fact has reached a turning point in 21st century physics and science, because we stand at a point, I'm going to talk about it briefly, and I've talked about this in the previous presentations. We stand at a point which is equivalent to Eddington's verification or validation of Einstein's general relativity theory. And as I said, whenever science, that's what Thomas Kuhn has taught us, that whenever science has to transition or undergo what he called a paradigmatic shift from an old standard paradigm to a new paradigm, which is this broader house relative to the room, an expansion of our understanding of the reality of the universe. So whenever science has to undergo a paradigmatic shift from the old standard paradigm to a new paradigm, which is much more expansive and includes the old paradigm, standard paradigm, as a special case, that's a turning point in scientific evolution that opens our eyes to a much broader understanding of the reality. And we stand at this point precisely because now, I'm mentioning this briefly, and there's been, as I said, now 60 peer-reviewed articles published in scientific journals. So recently, we've come to the point where we are actually have validated two unique critical predictions of God's Physics New Paradigm. God's Physics New Paradigm, by the way, has been called before the Computational Unified Field Theory in honor of Einstein's visionary quest for a unifying field theory. But in any event, we've reached a point where this new God's Physics paradigm or Computational Unified Field Theory paradigm has been now initially, has received initial empirical validation through two phenomena. One is the proton radius puzzle findings. That's already in 2010. That was discovered that there is a puzzle, something that cannot be explained by the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. Excuse me. So there's been a phenomena called the proton radius puzzle phenomena, which could not be explained or accounted for by the old material causal paradigm. And that proton radius puzzle phenomena or puzzle indicates that when we take a hydrogen atom and we replace the electron, the negatively charged electron that revolves around the proton nucleus, when we replace that electron with a muon, also a negatively charged particle, but much more massive, we find that in the second case of the muon replaced hydrogen atom, the nucleus, the radius of the nucleus of the proton actually reduces. And there's no explanation of this phenomena, but in fact, this phenomena has been explained and has been actually predicted as a unique critical prediction of God's physics new paradigm by God's physics paradigm. And essentially this stems from the new God's physics paradigm discovery of a singular higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, UCP. And that UCP simultaneously computes the whole universe as a series of frames. It computes the whole universe, or all exhaustive spatial pixels, comprising a series of universal frames at each trillionth of a second, etc. This UCP computes all the universe, all the spatial pixels, exhaustive spatial pixels of the universe as a frame, and that frame remains for a trillionth, etc. of a second. It's actually computed by c² divided by Planck's constant, which is part of the universal computational formula key discovery in this new God's physics paradigm. But in any event, so that c² divided by Planck's constant gives us 1.36 in the power of minus 50 per second, which means it's many trillions of times per second that this UCP produces a series, extremely rapid series of frames. And between one frame of the whole universe, universal frame, and the subsequent frame, the whole universe dissolves back into this UCP. So the UCP is producing the universe for a trillionth of a second. Then the universe dissolves back into this UCP. Then the UCP produces another consecutive frame, which is somewhat larger than the previous frame. And that explains, as I've talked about this point, it explains the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, which I may relate to in a second. So in any event, the God's physics new paradigm, unique critical prediction of the proton radius puzzle findings essentially stems from the fact that according to God's physics new paradigm, the four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time are computed simultaneously by this UCP for every spatial pixel, and they're computed as a degree of change or lack of change, consistency or inconsistency of every spatial pixel relative to the whole frame or relative to itself. In other words, in terms of its constituting composition. And so mass, for example, is computed as the object, meaning computing the spatial pixel relative to itself in the previous and previous frames. So object consistent computation of the UCP gives us the mass value. And so mass is, the more massive a particle is, the UCP computes it more spatially consistent, which means that it would be, we would measure it, or it explains the proton radius puzzle findings, that the more massive muon related proton decreases in its radius because of the more spatially consistent computation of the UCP for this muon relative to the electron, and obviously the relationship of the muon or the electron with the proton, which is influenced by the presence of this more massive muon relative to less massive electron. And so this is one indication, one clear validation, unique validation of a unique critical prediction of God's physics new paradigm. So one of them is the proton radius puzzle, which cannot be explained by relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which are part of the old material causal paradigm, but can be explained and actually have been predicted by the new God's physics paradigm. So this is, in a sense, equivalent to Eddington's verification and validation, empirical validation of Einstein's back then critical prediction, unique critical prediction of Mercury's double-valued perihelion pathway curvature around the sun. So this is one validation, clear validation, initial validation of God's physics paradigm, which again puts God's physics, a new paradigm, new 21st century paradigm, in a position which is exactly equivalent to Einstein's revolution of relativity theory. So we stand in the midst now of a scientific revolution of accepting the new paradigm, of God's physics or computational unified field theory paradigm. And that's a very exciting time, and it opens tremendous possibilities, not only to resolve the apparently theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, relativity theory about the macroscopic world, quantum mechanics about the microscopic world, which again is part of the paradigmatic crisis of the old paradigm. But it also opens tremendous new possibilities, which I'm going to touch upon, for science, and not less so for humanity, perhaps even more significantly for humanity. We must bear in mind, by the way, that science has received a mandate from humanity, in a sense, to discover, investigate, and discover truth. And as long as science carries out this very important role, it can and it does advance humanity towards a much better understanding of the universe. And lo and behold, this is part of what we're speaking about today. It's time for Geulah. So lo and behold, now this new scientific revolution, the acceptance of the acceptance of the new God's physics paradigm as the new 21st century scientific paradigm, which is what's occurring now based on the validation of this two critical predictions. The acceptance of this new God's physics paradigm allows science, and even more so humanity, to reach a very significant, profound point in the development of humanity and the universe. The second, just in brackets, the second critical prediction that has received initial empirical validation, and again places God's physics in a turning point, as being accepted and recognized by the scientific community, or by science, as the new paradigm, satisfactory paradigm for 21st century science and physics. The second critical prediction that has received initial empirical validation is regarding the non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe. And this non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe cannot be explained again by the old material causal paradigm. The old material causal paradigm, in brackets, because I've spoken about this in previous presentations, the old material causal paradigm assumes, or has assumed, for 20th century physics, and now it's transitioning into the new God's physics paradigm. But in any event, the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics assumed that everything in the universe can be explained and is actually caused by direct or indirect cause and effect physical interactions and relationships existing in the universe. The clear classical example maybe would be the Big Bang model of relativity theory, general relativity theory. And this Big Bang model essentially assumes that the creation of the universe was caused by an initial nuclear event, which then created suns, galaxies, space, time, energy, and mass, and which also gave the impetus for the accelerated expansion of the universe. That old material causal Big Bang model has been negated by the new God's physics acausal computation paradigm. I've spoken about this extensively, but I just want to point out that the since we know that the old material causal paradigm has reached a dead end, in a sense, or has reached the limit of the usefulness of that room, that which we have to expand now to the house, etc. So since we know that the old paradigm has reached that limit, and I spoke about it, we know, based on Thomas Kuhn's analysis, we know that the old material causal paradigm has reached the end or the limits of its usefulness, because we've seen the signs, the clear signs of a paradigmatic crisis, of the limits of the old standard paradigm. And briefly, as I've written the book, as I've published in over 60 peer-reviewed articles and lectured in keynote opening talks and previous lectures, video lectures, that we know that the old paradigm has reached its limit, or has reached the state of paradigmatic crisis, because we have both a contradiction, an apparent contradiction between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which are incompatible. And that's one thing. And the other thing is that we've seen that the old material causal paradigm assumes that apropos what we've been speaking about now, the old material causal paradigm assumes that the universe is expanding, that the accelerated expansion of the universe is due to purely hypothetical dark matter and dark energy concepts, which very surprisingly now are assumed to account for up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe, but yet they cannot be found. So for 2 decades now, dark matter, dark energy, after extensive investigations and experimentations, they've not been detected. And as I've mentioned, there's been one of the last issues of Scientific American with an article titled The Last Stand of Dark Matter, Dark Energy. Scientific community is essentially starting to be quite skeptical and questionable about the actual existence of dark matter, dark energy. And as I said, and I mentioned, this is very reminiscent of Einstein's discarding of the purely hypothetical ether concept of 19th century Newtonian mechanics. Back then as well, there was an assumption that the whole universe was perfused by this hypothetical and elusive, in a sense, ether concept, which could not be found. And when Einstein, following Michelson-Morley's experiment and other experiments, Einstein said if it cannot be found, then it has to be discarded. It's superfluous and it has to be discarded. And I've done the same thing in one of those 60 plus peer-reviewed articles. The title of that article was "Could Dark Matter, Dark Energy be Superfluous?" i.e. non-existent. So the two signs of the paradigmatic crisis of the old paradigm are, one, the theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and the other thing is that the old paradigm cannot explain, in a sense, where 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe exists. And so those are clear signs of paradigmatic crisis, or of the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics reaching the end of their usefulness. And now then this has led to the new God's physics paradigm. So what I'm saying is that the second critical prediction that has already received initial empirical validation by the new God's physics paradigm essentially relates to that unexplained phenomena, first of the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, which is assumed by the old model to be related to dark matter, dark energy. But again, we said they're purely hypothetical. They have to be discarded. They could not be detected after 2 decades of intensive investigation, so they have to be discarded. But the point of the matter is that the second critical prediction of God's physics new paradigm essentially says that the critical prediction is that the universe would undergo non-continuous leaps, non-continuous increases in the rate of the universe's expansion rate, accelerated rate of expansion, which have to do something with what I called a collective human consciousness focus, since this universal consciousness principle or computational principle or universal conscious reality is the sole reality that is producing the universe, dissolving it back to itself, then reproducing and evolving the universe. There is a postulate in this new God's physics paradigm which says that whenever you have a collective human consciousness focus of many individuals, such as, for example, the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, 2 days time interval of the new year for the Jewish people, you have millions of Jews all over the world focusing and praying to this universal consciousness reality, i.e. God in religious terms. And so there is a theoretical postulate. One of the theoretical postulates of this new God's physics paradigm essentially says that when you have this collective human consciousness focus of millions of Jews, in this case, focusing collective human consciousness, so millions of Jews are focusing on this collective universal consciousness, i.e. God, then you would have a non-continuous leap in the rate of the universe's accelerated rate of expansion. So I called already to cosmologists, astronomers, to test this. Just recent Jewish Rosh Hashanah 2 days time interval elapsed during the 7th and 8th of September 2021, and I called astronomers and cosmologists to measure precisely the rate of the universe's expansion prior to the 7th, 8th, and from the 7th, 8th, and onwards, with a critical prediction that the universe will undergo a non-continuous accelerated expansion. I've not received yet definitive confirmation of that critical prediction. I'm still calling for astronomers, cosmologists to communicate with me directly. I've given my direct email, which is Dr. Bentwich, DRBENTWICH @gmail.com. But in any event, that specific critical prediction about the non-continuous accelerated rate of the universe's expansion associated with collective human consciousness time intervals, that prediction has received now initial empirical validation, because there is, regardless of the specific date of the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, which again should be tested and I believe will be confirmed, but regardless of those specific dates, the fact that we find that the universe, we already know that the universe is expanding in an accelerated rate, and that there's been a non-continuous change in that rate of the universe's expansion. And this is due to what is known, and I've published articles about this. There's a basic gap, which I call the astronomical cosmological gap in the universe's accelerated expansion. We know it's an unexplained phenomenon for relativity theory and quantum mechanics, just as the proton radius puzzle is an unexplained phenomena for the old material causal paradigm. So this puzzle of the gap between the early measurements of the universe's accelerated expansion, which is lower, significantly lower than the current measurements the early, cosmological measurements of the universe's expansion is significantly lower. There's a gap between the lower rate of the early universe background radiation rate of the universe's expansion to the current astronomical measurement of a higher, significantly higher rate of the universe's accelerated expansion. And that gap is unexplained by the old material causal paradigm, or at least not in a satisfactory manner. And so the fact that we see a non-continuous change or increase in the universe's accelerated expansion from the early cosmological background radiation to the current contemporary astronomical higher rate of the universe's accelerated expansion is unexplained by the old model, old material causal paradigm model, but is actually precisely confirming the critical prediction, as I mentioned, of the new God's physics paradigm, regardless of the measurements, and that should be validated, by the way, as a further validation, that it has something to do with specific times, such as the collective human consciousness focus, such as in the Jewish Rosh Hashanah. But regardless, the fact that we find this non-continuous change in the universe's rate of accelerated expansion from the early cosmological to the contemporary astronomical rate of the universe's accelerated expansion, that confirms God's physics non-continuous acceleration rate of the universe. So we have now two indications, two validations, empirical validations of the new God's physics critical predictions, which is essentially precisely equivalent to what has confirmed Einstein's general theory of relativity by Eddington's verification of, again, an equivalent critical prediction. In that case, it was about Mercury's perihelion double value pathway around the sun. So we stand at an exciting point or turning point in science, because essentially science now has to recognize, and is recognizing, that the new paradigm, we're transitioning now from the old material causal paradigm to the new God's physics acausal computation paradigm. And before I reach the focus of today's presentation, which is the new God's physics 21st century paradigm, it's time for Geulah, and understanding the plan and the direction of the universe's evolution towards an ultimate Geulah state. That's an intrinsic drive of this universal conscious reality to take the universe, or manifest the universe, from its initial inanimate matter form of consciousness through animate plants, animals, human beings, and towards that ultimate goal of the whole creation of the universe, which is the Geulah state of perfection for humanity and for science and for the universe. Before I delve into this exciting topic in this very special day, I just want to highlight the fact. So So first of all, we understand that science is already making this transition, paradigmatic shift from the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics for 20th century physics, which was satisfactory for a while, but now it's giving way, it's expanding in a sense into the new God's physics paradigm, a causal computation paradigm. So I want to say a few words, especially for those viewers and listeners that perhaps have not seen all the previous videos and have not still read this fascinating new God's physics book published by iUniverse. So I want to say something about the new God's physics paradigm. First of all, as I said, it's based on the discovery, the exciting discovery of a new higher ordered singular universal consciousness / computational principle or reality, UCP or UCR. And so the new God's physics paradigm is based on the discovery of this singular higher ordered universal consciousness or computational principle, UCP, or universal conscious reality. And since this major discovery that the UCP simultaneously computes, as we said, the whole universe as a universal frame simultaneously, then the universal frame dissolves back into this UCP, then the UCP creates a subsequent frame which is somewhat larger. It adds a certain amount of exhaustive spatial pixels to each frame that it produces. We said this is happening at the incredible rate of c squared divided by Planck's constant, which gives us 1.36 in the power of minus 50 per second. So it's many trillions of times per second. And essentially, the discovery, this major discovery, major breakthrough, that the UCP in fact is producing the universe simultaneously, dissolving it back into itself and reproducing it at this incredible rate, because of the simultaneity of the UCP's computation of each subsequent frame, and because of the complete dissolution of the whole universe back into this UCP in between frames, the new paradigm is called the acausal computational paradigm, acausal computation paradigm, which essentially is saying that there cannot be any cause and effect existing either within any given frame or across frames. I've given this metaphor so many times, but so far I can't find a different metaphor. I said that if we had a glass filled with juice and we had a hammer, this is the cell phone representing the hammer, hitting the glass, and then we see the glass is shattered and the juice is spilled over the table. What seems to the naked eye is that there is a cause and effect relationship, that the hammer, i.e. cell phone, is hitting the glass jar or cup, and then this is causing the shattering of the glass and spilling of the juice. But when we slow it down, we see that because in every given frame they're presented simultaneously, then there cannot be any cause and effect, because regardless of the proximity between them, in each frame they're presented simultaneously. Even in the frame that they're hitting or touching each other, there's no cause and effect because they're presented simultaneously. And remember that in between the frames, the whole picture, or in the metaphor, the whole universe, is dissolving back into this UCP. So any two spatial pixels, like the glass cup or juice glass cup and the hammer, any two objects, any two spatial pixels cannot have really any direct or even indirect material causal interaction. There's no interaction, there's no cause and effect possible, because they're presented simultaneously regardless of how close they are to each other. And between one frame and another, the whole universe dissolves back into the UCP. There's no physical relationships between one frame and another. So therefore, we reach the inevitable conclusion that the new God's physics paradigm is an acausal computation paradigm. And an acausal computation paradigm essentially tells us there's no cause and effect. That's quite dramatic, because it, in a sense, negates the basic premise, the basic assumption of the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which assumes that everything in the universe is the result of cause and effect interactions. And therefore, the new God's physics paradigm negates and negated, again, published extensively and presented in international conferences, special issues. But this new God's physics paradigm negates some of the basic assumptions of the old material causal paradigm, such as the Big Bang model. The universe was not created by an initial nuclear event, because there could not have been any direct or indirect physical interaction or material causal relationships between a nuclear event and its creation of suns, galaxies, space-time, mass, energy, etc. The universe is not expanding because of the initial Big Bang nuclear event, and was not expanding because of that nuclear event, nor can it expand by purely hypothetical and i.e. non-existent dark matter, dark energy, because even regardless of the fact that they cannot be detected, therefore they have to be discarded, even theoretically, even if dark matter and dark energy did exist, which we see that they're not existent, but even if we had such purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy, they could not interact with the galaxies, suns, etc. and cause their expulsion, because there's no cause and effect in any single or multiple frames, between frames, within frames. So we're negating and actually challenging and transcending and in fact embedding some of the old concepts that appeared in the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. The basic assumptions of material causality is collapsing, is negated. So there's the Big Bang model is negated. The universe was not created by the Big Bang model. The universe is not expanding based on Einstein's general relativity, Einstein's equations, assuming a material causal interaction between massive objects and their causing of the curvature of space-time, and that curved space-time is causing or determining the traveling pathways of massive and less massive objects. That also is negated. And by the same token, by the way, the old material causal paradigm second model of quantum mechanics, assuming that any subatomic phenomena measurement or existence is the result of direct interaction between subatomic probe element and the subatomic target's assumed probability wave function, and that interaction is causing the collapse of the subatomic target's probability wave function into a single complementary space, energy, time, mass value. That is also a material causal assumption, or is based on a material causal assumption, and that's negated by the new acausal computation paradigm. By the way, perhaps it's a good place to mention, I always like the Einstein's great scientist remark. He said that common sense is only that which is common to the senses, and he essentially encouraged us not to take for granted some of the assumptions that we have. Same way that it was assumed that time is constant, that there is the ether concept. And Einstein, characterized by childlike, innocent questioning of everything and willingness to challenge old notions and look for the truth. We're encouraged to do the same thing, and we stand at a point where that's what's necessary. Whenever there is a paradigmatic shift and an expansion of our understanding of the reality, we need to adopt that courageous, innocent, childlike, in a sense, seeking for truth, which may be common sense is only that which is common to the senses. It doesn't necessarily imply that if we've believed and we've been accustomed to think that time is constant across the universe, it doesn't mean that that's the truth. And Einstein discovered that was not true. It doesn't mean that if we're accustomed to think that there's dark matter and dark energy which cannot be detected, maybe they don't exist, as the new God's physics paradigm asserts, and so on and so forth. So this new transition from the old material causal assumption that we thought that the universe is existing and evolving and originated by cause and effect, that's crashing. That's in a sense negated. The new paradigm is saying everything is dependent on the continuous creation, dissolution, recreation, sustenance, and evolution by this singular, higher ordered universal consciousness principle, or computational principle, UCP. And we have to adjust our thinking now and expand our thinking and realize that the universe as we've seen it is not the real universe. We're now expanding, opening the door and seeing the house or the neighborhood, so to speak. So we now explain that the new causal computation paradigm of God's physics, new paradigm, which has been validated already for the new 21st century physics and science, that new causal computation paradigm is pushing the limits of our thinking to start realizing that the universe, and this is the next step I'm going to speak about, starting to grasp and wrap our minds, so to speak, around the new understanding of God's physics, conception, and realization of the universe. The universe does not exist as a solid, continuous, objective, physical reality. So I'm going to highlight now two theoretical postulates. One is the computational invariance principle. The other one is the universal consciousness principle. They're very much associated with each other. And they're telling us essentially that since the universe and all the spatial pixels in the universe, with their four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time, the physical universe does not exist all the time. It exists only during, remember we said there is a series of universal frames. So every spatial pixel in the universe and the whole universe as a whole exists only transiently, only temporarily. When we have a frame, a universal frame produced by this universal computational / consciousness principle, the UCP, whenever the UCP creates or computes simultaneously a whole universal frame of the universe, then the universe exists, and exists for a very short period of time, for a trillionth of a trillionth, etc. of a second. Remember 1.36 in the power minus 50, many trillions of times per second. So the universe exists for a very brief, extremely brief period of time. And then it dissolves, it ceases to exist between the frames. The universe dissolves back into the UCP, and then the UCP creates the universe again. So the computational invariance principle is shaking our minds in a sense, in a good way, in a profound way, and it's telling us the universe doesn't exist all the time. The universe is a transient phenomena. It's a transient phenomenal appearance which exists only for a short period of time. It appears to exist all the time, but it doesn't exist all the time. And it exists in a sense only as dependent upon and as created by the singular higher universal consciousness principle. So when we contrast the transient phenomenal existence of the universe and all its spatial pixels, when we contrast that a transient phenomenal existence of the universe existing only during the frames and as produced and dependent entirely upon the computation, the simultaneous computation of the UCP of every spatial pixel, when we contrast the transient phenomenal existence of the universe only during the frames but not in between the frames, to the constant, continuous existence of the UCP. The UCP, according to God's physics' new accepted paradigm, 21st century accepted paradigm and validated paradigm, the God's physics' new paradigm is telling us that even in between the frames, when the universe dissolves back into the UCP does exist. The UCP exists, universal consciousness principle, reality exists both during the frame when it is solely creating and computing all the universe, creating the universe, and it also exists in between the frames at which time the universe dissolves back into this UCP. So we're contrasting here. There's something that is transient, phenomenal, doesn't exist all the time, and is created and is dependent totally upon the UCP. And then there's the UCP. The UCP is constant, it's continuous, it's non-changeable, it's existing all the time. In the scientific language, I called the transient phenomenal appearance or existence of the universe as computationally variant element, as opposed to computational invariant element or principle, which is the universal consciousness principle, reality, which exists all the time. And so the computational invariance principle is telling us that the universe is only transient phenomenal manifestation of this real and constant universal computational / consciousness principle. And then this leads us to the even more profound universal consciousness reality, which essentially is telling us that the universe is really only a manifestation, a transient phenomenal manifestation of the real reality, the only real reality of this universal consciousness reality. So the universal consciousness reality postulate, profound postulate, highly profound postulate, is telling us, listen, we have to change our view of the universe. The universe is only, we don't want to say an illusion, but it's only a transient phenomenal manifestation of the real reality, which is the universal conscious reality. And really there's only one reality. This universal conscious reality is the only reality. And for a while it manifests it clothes itself, so to speak, where it manifests as the universe. And then it drops the universe or dissolves the universe back into itself. So there's only one reality, that's the universal conscious reality, and that universal conscious reality is manifesting as the universe for a short period of time, and then it's existing without the universe as the universal conscious reality. So really the universe is only a transient phenomenal manifestation of the sole reality, single reality of this universal conscious reality. That's quite a profound change in our view and understanding of the universe. Excuse me. And essentially what it's telling us is that we're starting to change our view of the universe. The universe is no longer a solid existing or existent phenomenon. It's actually a continuous creation, dissolution, recreation, evolution. It's only a representation or a manifestation of the real reality of this universal consciousness reality. And that's a major change in our understanding of the universe. And then the next step, of course, which is leading us more and more now towards the fulfillment of the topic of this exciting video, and that is about it's time for Geulah. But before we get to that, I just want to mention a few more postulates, theoretical postulates that have been discovered and are part of this new exciting God's physics, new already validated scientific paradigm for 21st century physics. So, for example, I want to mention the fact that a few things, and it's also important for us to mention that because, you know, especially for the layman audience, as well as for scientists, when we start realizing the profound accomplishments and advancements of this new God's physics paradigm of our understanding, basic understanding of the universe, it gives us a sense of awe and respect, and also great joy about this expansion in the understanding and knowledge gained and seen and open up for science and for humanity by this new God's physics paradigm. So I should mention the fact that we said that there's a contradiction, apparent contradiction between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And this has been resolved by God's physics new paradigm. At the center of God's physics new paradigm, there is what I mentioned already, the universal computational formula. The universal computational formula is a formula that for the first time in physics, theoretical physics, has been able to unify the four basic elements of space, energy, mass, and time in one. They've been completely integrated in this universal computational formula, or in God's physics new paradigm. Remember that Einstein's general theory of relativity was able to unify between space and time as a four-dimensional continuum, energy and mass as the energy mass equivalence, E equals mc squared, famous equation of Einstein, which led to nuclear energy, etc. And then, so between space-time, energy and mass, and the curvature of space-time, the assumed curvature of space-time by massive objects. This has been challenged, by the way, because it denotes a material causal interaction. This is challenged and offered an alternative explanation by this new God's physics acausal computational paradigm. But in any event, we see that Einstein's great accomplishment and relativity theory, general relativity theory, as I mentioned, is considered the greatest single intellectual achievement of any single human being. It's a wonderful and amazing discovery. But science has to evolve, so the room has to be expanded, etc. So we just mentioned the fact that Einstein's general theory of relativity was able to unify space-time, energy, mass, curvature of space-time by massive objects, but it was not yet able to unify between these four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time. And this is accomplished, or has been accomplished, by the new God's physics paradigm, because God's physics paradigm is essentially telling us through this universal computational formula that the universal computational formula, by the way, it's depicted at the bottom of this wonderful book. The universal computational formula is unifying the four basic physical features as produced by this singular higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, UCP. And we mentioned already at the rate of c squared divided by Planck's constant. So that equation, that universal computational formula, which recently has been expanded. I'll talk about it. But that universal computational formula essentially is unifying space, energy, mass, and time based on the simultaneous computation of this UCP at this incredible rate of c squared divided by Planck's constant, 1.36 in the power of minus 50. So that UCP is computing simultaneously every spatial pixel in the universe. For every spatial pixel in the universe, which is completed simultaneously, it's computing the four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time. And that universal computational formula is unifying that computation of the UCP for all spatial pixels and the four basic physical features. That's the first time in physics that the four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time have been unified, which is a great accomplishment, and it also points at the fact that they don't exist independently. And just in brackets, because I've spoken about this, it's an extensive topic. The way that this UCP is able to integrate space, energy, mass, and time is by discovering that the UCP has three computational dimensions. Two are more relevant for us right now, which is consistency and framework. And essentially, consistency is when the UCP is computing to the degree to which a certain pixel remains the same, whether relative to the whole frame or whether relative to itself in terms of its composition. So consistency or inconsistency, whether it's the same or it's different, and what's the degree of sameness or difference. That so the UCP has two relevant computational dimensions of framework, which is relative, whether the computation is relative to the whole frame or the computation is regarding the constitution of a certain object, and then consistency, change or lack of change. And the four possible combinations between framework, which comprises frame or object, and consistency, which comprises consistent or inconsistent, these four possible combinations gives us frame consistent UCP computation would be space, frame inconsistent computation would be energy, object consistent computation would be mass, and object inconsistent computation would be time. And so we start looking at the universe in a completely different way. It's a very plastic way, in a sense, of looking at the universe. We see that the computation of space and energy are, and also of mass and time, are integrated as, and are byproducts, integral computations of this UCP, computing frame consistent or inconsistent, meaning space or energy, and object consistent or inconsistent, meaning mass and time, and they're all integrated, they're all related. Fascinating. So it's the first time in physics that space, energy, mass, and time have been integrated together. They're pointing as they're being seen as secondary computational byproducts of the sole singular UCP computation, simultaneous computation of all exhaustive spatial pixels in the universe. This is also led, by the way, I've had a major presentation about this and talks and lectures. This has also led to the complete unification of the four basic forces of nature, which has not been resolved. The gravitational force so far has not been unified with the other three forces that have been unified, and now the four are being unified in a different way. So that's another accomplishment. And the new causal computational God's physics paradigm has also two major postulates, which is leading us to the focus of today's presentation. One is the moral principle. In other words, the UCP, because we understand that the creation of all the frames is really, the universe doesn't exist as a solid reality. It's a manifestation, transient phenomenal manifestation of the UCP. And as such, we understand that all the frames and all the evolution and all the creation of the universe and its evolution are really plastic. They're really created by, I don't want to say they're an illusion, but they're just a representation or a manifestation of the real reality that's creating them, which is this universal consciousness reality or principle. And so we start looking at the characteristics of this universal consciousness reality or principle. And some of these characteristics, I'll speak about briefly about the 10 hierarchical computational dimensions of this singular higher ordered universal conscious reality, and that's also related to the expansion of what I mentioned earlier, the universal computational formula that's been expanded now to include these 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, which are characterizing this singular universal conscious reality. But what I want to say is that we start looking at the characteristics of this singular higher order universal consciousness reality, or UCP, and two key characteristics are one, the moral principle. I call it the dynamic equilibrium moral principle. And essentially this moral principle, dynamic equilibrium moral principle, is for the first time in physics, is teaching us, or is discovered, that the UCP, because it's characterized by oneness, by all goodness, by morality, again here is the moral principle, dynamic equilibrium moral principle, but essentially one of the characteristics, the key characteristics of this universal consciousness principle reality, or UCP, is its moral principle, because it's all oneness and has those characteristics of peace, morality, Geulah, which I'll speak about in a sense. So the moral principle, the dynamic equilibrium moral principle, is essentially telling us that the UCP, for human beings, we possess the most expansive form of consciousness. I'll talk about it in a second. But we possess the most expansive form of consciousness. We also possess free moral choice. Obviously, the other preceding and gradually more expansive forms of consciousness, which is the inanimate matter, all produced and evolved by this UCP, which I'll talk about in a second. But the inanimate matter, the plants, the animate plants, animals, and then human beings, all the preceding forms of consciousness, of this universal consciousness reality, they do not possess this expansive form of human consciousness, which also entails a free moral choice. And because we human beings possess this free moral choice, the dynamic equilibrium moral principle is essentially stating that the universal consciousness reality or principle is balancing and is teaching, in a sense, and echoing and advancing humanity and each one of us, each individual human being, through this basic dynamic equilibrium moral principle. It's essentially saying that any time, because we're all individual human consciousness, as well as, by the way, all exhaustive spatial pixels, are really only a part of, we said they're a manifestation of this universal consciousness reality. So there is an intrinsic dynamic equilibrium moral principle to this universal conscious reality or principle or reality, which is the dynamic equilibrium moral principle is essentially balancing and teaching each individual human being and humanity as a whole to respect and to realize that we're all part of the same reality, this singular integrated universal consciousness reality. So whenever any individual human consciousness, i.e. person or individual, God forbid, is inflicting pain or suffering upon another human being, this triggers or instigates a corrective action of this universal conscious reality. There is a few postulates related with that. So one of them is the multi-spatial temporal reservoir of this universal consciousness / computational principle or reality, which essentially says that the UCP possesses a multi-spatial temporal reservoir of all past, present, and multiple possible futures universal frames. So there's a bank that's existing within this universal consciousness reality or UCP, and that bank or reservoir of all past universal frames, present universal frame, and multiple possible futures universal frames, that reservoir then is one individual future, possible future, is selected by this universal consciousness reality or UCP for each individual human being based on our moral or immoral actions and choices. So if an individual human being, a person, has inflicted, God forbid, pain or suffering upon another individual human being, the UCP will select a corresponding future, one possible future that in a sense would position or allow the person that was offending or injuring another person, would allow that person to experience the same kind of lack of comfort or suffering, God forbid, that he or she inflicted upon another human being. And vice versa, by the way, when a person decides to bestow goodness, happiness, assistance to another human being, again, the UCP or UCR, Universal Conscious Reality, would echo and reinforce that positive moral action and would actually select, again, one of multiple possible futures, in this case, a good future, a positive future in which that individual that, thank God, has done or chosen a moral action, a positive moral action towards another human being, assisting them, helping them, etc., encouraging them, assisting them materially or psychologically, etc., spiritually. So the universal conscious reality will select one of multiple futures, in this case a positive future, a good future, that would echo and reinforce and enumerate that individual for the good action. So the dynamic equilibrium moral principle essentially is a basic principle or basic characteristic. It's also part of those 10 hierarchical computational dimensions of the UCP or UCR, but that's a major principle of the UCP for the selection, again, for each individual human being of one of multiple possible futures. By the way, and I'll speak about it in a bit, because it's mind-boggling. It may bring us to a sense of great awe and respect towards this singular, higher-ordered universal conscious reality, which is way beyond the imagination of our minds. If we just think about for a second about the infinite intelligence and infinite complexity of this universal conscious reality, which has to compute according to this new God's physics paradigm, and the dynamic equilibrium moral principle has to compute for each one of the billions of individuals on the planet today, has to compute for each individual human being for every second or every moment, has to compute one of multiple possible futures, and not just for that individual, because it has to do with other individual human beings which have either bestowed happiness and goodness or, God forbid, have caused suffering to that individual. So it's unfathomable, the intelligence, the complexity, the goodness of this universal conscious reality. But in any event, so we understand that this universal conscious reality is operating, is advancing the world, is computing the possible, one of multiple possible futures frames for each of the billions of individuals on the planet at every given moment in time. So that's a major discovery. Again, the first time in physics that morality becomes a major organizing principle and driving influence for the evolution of the world. And now perhaps we're ready to enter and focus on the major topic of today's presentation. I apologize, we have to make all these introductions in a sense, and we have to grasp in our mind and change our minds to start understanding the beauty, the complexity, the grandness of this new God's physics perspective, new perspective for science, and even more so for humanity. So we need all these, in a sense, preparations and all of these understandings, and essentially I'm assuming that any person watching the video, without necessarily seeing all the previous videos, should have some benefit from it and should gain some understanding of this new exciting, new accepted paradigm of science, of the world and the universe. So, but now we're ready in a sense to embrace and to start focusing on today's major focus, which is it's new God's physics 21st century paradigm. It's time for Geulah. So I have to again highlight the fact that according to this new God's physics paradigm, the whole purpose and goal and progression of the universe, evolution of the universe, is, as we said, was not caused by a Big Bang nuclear event, is not caused by a non-existent dark matter, dark energy, is not caused by Einstein's material causal assumption equations. The universe has been created from the get start with a view or with a purpose to reach the ultimate goal of the universe. The ultimate goal of the universe, defined by this singular higher order universal conscious reality, is reaching a perfected Geulah state. And as I stated, Geulah, the term Geulah is borrowed or is taken from Jewish Hasidic thought and Jewish thought in general, and that is the idea that the universe, the world, is evolving towards a perfected state. This Geulah state is a state in which humanity specifically recognizes the oneness, the singularity, the all-goodness, the morality, the peace and peaceful characteristic of this singular higher order reality. Again, in religious terms, we would call it God. So the Geulah state is a term that in God's physics new paradigm is denoting or referring to the idea that the singular higher ordered universal conscious reality has pre-planned and is executing actually the evolution of the universe towards a perfected Geulah state. And that perfected Geulah state highlighting humanity, human beings, and their realization, by the way, also key through science, but humanity's and science's recognition, realization of this Geulah state, this perfected moral, spiritual, and even physical state. So just to understand this or highlight this whole progression, we have another postulate which is very much related to this Geulah state and to the topic of it's time for Geulah. And that postulate is called the reverse time Geulah Goal hypothesis or postulate, and it's essentially telling us something quite remarkable, but really even commonsensical when we grasp our minds around it. And that postulate, the reverse time Geulah Goal postulate or hypothesis, is telling us. I'll give a metaphor which I've given before. Imagine a king wanting to build a palace and hiring an architect, a great, famous architect, to construct that palace. We would easily recognize the fact that the architect would have to plan the palace with all of its beauty, the stones, the marbles, the carpets, the lighting, etc. The architect would have to plan everything about this palace before, have a blueprint for the palace before any stone would be placed, any construction worker or any action would be taken to start building the palace. That's obvious. So we realize that without having an immaculate and exhaustive plan for the building of the palace, how it would look like, how it's going to be constructed, how it's going to operate, everything in the palace has to be laid out, has to be pre-thought and pre-planned, and we would see it in a blueprint that the architect would plan, and then other designers and workers and other actions would be taken to materialize this blueprint plan. So the plan is the plan for the palace has to be made way before and as a critical condition before the construction of the palace. And somewhat similar or equivalent is this reverse time Geulah Goal postulate or hypothesis, which essentially tells us that this singular higher ordered universal consciousness reality had to pre-plan the whole evolution and the whole progression of the universe towards that ultimate goal, in the same way that the architect, the great architect, has in mind the goal, which is a complete, beautiful, immaculate palace. The same way this universal conscious reality has had a pre-planned program to move the universe, create a universe, sustain the universe, evolve the universe from inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, towards the goal. Everything is constructed towards that goal, that ultimate goal, which is the Geulah state. The Geulah state is when we have human beings which possess the free moral choice that we spoke about and the ability to recognize and to acknowledge and actually live by the recognition of this singular higher ordered universal conscious reality, or God in religious terms. So the idea is that the reverse time Geulah Goal postulate is telling us that this universal consciousness reality has pre-planned the whole universe to evolve towards that perfected Geulah state. And that means, that implies creating the inanimate, the forms, the more increasingly more expansive forms of consciousness, from inanimate matter through animate plants and animals and human beings. So we have to have this progression, and the goal is to reach that perfected Geulah state, Geulah Goal state. And we call it the reverse time Geulah Goal postulate or hypothesis, because we have to realize that everything is computed from the end, from that Geulah, perfected Geulah Goal state. That's the goal, and it's the whole progression of the universe is computed from the end goal. And so we're now reaching the understanding that, in a sense, this new God's physics paradigm is telling us, listen, the universe was not created by chance. It wasn't created by a random nuclear event, Big Bang event. It's not created, it's not evolving by material causal interactions of Einstein's equations. It's not evolving and drifting apart just into nothingness. That's not the real progression. That's not the real plan of the construction of the universe. The universe was created and is being continuously created, as I'm going to speak about briefly, by this universal conscious reality, which is really the real reality, the only real reality behind the universe, and creating the universe, dissolving it, recreating and evolving it. And that universal consciousness reality, or UCP, has been continuously planning and evolving the universe towards that perfected Geulah goal. Now, when we speak about the topic, which is it's time for Geulah, we start by saying, okay, if we realize that the whole purpose and plan for the creation and evolution of the universe, and in brackets I'm going to mention what I have written about, has been published and lectured, implied within this is obviously that Darwin's natural selection principle, as if the evolution of the species has been created by material cause and effect, the survival of the fittest, the interaction between more compatible and less compatible organisms, specific organisms which possess specific genetic mutations, and the survival of only those compatible organisms. That's assuming, again, material cause and effect, which is negated, has been negated, and cannot exist within this new God's physics acausal computation paradigm. So what we're realizing is that we're getting into the point that we understand that the universe has been pre-planned and is evolving towards that Geulah perfected state. And when we say it's time for Geulah, well, science now, this new God's physics paradigm, which has been validated, is reaching the point of essentially opening the window, opening the door to the ultimate Geulah goal of the universe. It's a very exciting time. So in a sense, this new God's physics paradigm has tremendous implications, not only for science, but for humanity as well. If, in fact, the universal conscious reality, which is the soul reality, and we're seeing that through everything that we've been speaking about today and previously, that there's only one reality, that one reality is this universal conscious reality. That universal conscious reality is creating the universe, dissolving it, recreating it, and evolving it. And it's doing so only with a view in mind of reaching that perfected Geulah state goal of the universe, in which humanity and science, more specifically, or science through the window of science and scientific understanding, the whole of humanity is starting to realize that really there's only one singular reality. That one singular reality is typified by those 10 hierarchical computational dimensions. I'm not sure I'm going to speak about it today, but maybe I'm going to touch upon it. But part of those, we are understanding that the universal conscious reality has this moral principle. We are understanding that the universal conscious reality is interested and is aiming the world and driving the universe and humanity towards that Geulah state. And we're entering, science and humanity is entering that beginning. We're at the brink and the very beginning of this new understanding of Geulah. Because when science and the new God's physics paradigm is telling us that the sole reality behind the universe is this universal conscious reality, i.e. God in religious terms, and when this new God's physics paradigm is telling us that the characteristics of how this universal conscious reality is creating the world, key within this is the moral principle. The moral principle is teaching humanity and each individual human being that we're all part of this universal conscious reality, And it's bringing us to the point of the Geulah state. The Geulah state is a morally, spiritually, and even physically perfected state in which we will not have essentially any aggression. Human beings and humanity will live in peace and harmony, because I gave the metaphor. In the same way that a human being, a mentally balanced human being, would not take their right hand and inflict pain on their left hand because it's part of the same human being, the dynamic equilibrium moral principle, and even more so the Geulah state, perfected state goal of the whole creation of the universe, the Geulah state, perfected morally, spiritual, and even physically state, implies that humanity, each individual human being, or most human beings at least, mentally balanced human beings, will realize that there's only one reality. And we would realize through science, through this new scientific paradigm, that in the same way that we won't take our right hand to inflict pain on the left hand, we understand now that our moral or immoral actions, are actually doing two things. When I'm helping another human being, I'm actually, in a sense, determining to a large extent the universal conscious reality's selection of a positive corresponding future for myself and any human being. It's the same way that you would say today a mentally balanced human being would not step out of, let's say, the 10th floor window because they know there's a gravitational force and they may injure themselves. So they won't do it. And in much the same way, this new God's physics paradigm is starting to open our eyes. And I'm going to refer to the great Lubavitcher Rebbe and the Hasidic thought, especially in this great day, because they've been highlighting and been saying this truth for thousands of years, and now for the past 250 years by the Alter Rebbe. Today we're celebrating something significant about this Alter Rebbe and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, teaching us, in a sense, to open our eyes and realize this reality. And as I've written, by the way, in this wonderful God's physics book, there's a chapter actually devoted to that. There's great correspondence or convergence between Hasidic Jewish thought and this new scientific paradigm, which is inspiring for all of us. But the idea is that in the same way that, again, a mentally balanced human being would not step out of their window on the 10th floor because they know there's a gravitational force and they may injure themselves, with this new God's physics paradigm and the moral principle and the Geulah state, every human being, every mentally balanced human being, would realize more and more that it's not good for us individually and it's not good for humanity to inflict pain on another human being. And in fact, when we start opening our eyes and realizing that we are all integral parts, inseparable parts of this singular, unitary oneness of the universal conscious reality, and it's characterized by all goodness, by morality, by Geulah, by peace, then this would lead to the Geulah state in which all human beings would live in peace, or at least all mentally balanced human beings would live in peace. Again, with the same understanding that we would not inflict pain on ourselves. And when we really understand, when science really realizes and really accepts this new understanding that the physical reality is not a material entity which exists solidly and continuously. The physical reality is created and dissolved and recreated and evolved by this universal conscious reality. And the universal conscious reality, which is the only reality, is pushing the world and humanity and the universe towards that perfected Geulah state. And that perfected Geulah state essentially tells us we're all one, we're all part of the same universal conscious reality, and we all have to act in a moral way for our benefit and for the benefit of humanity and this Geulah state. So we start realizing that the Geulah state is a perfected moral, spiritual, and even physical state. And the new God's physics paradigm is opening our eyes, as a Lubavitcher Rebbe, by the way, has encouraged and is encouraging all of us to do, to open our eyes and see the reality, which is this singular universal conscious reality. So this Geulah state, when I say it's time for Geulah, it means that the science, God's physics new paradigm, has reached that point in which it realizes that the whole universe is only a manifestation of the universal conscious reality, and that the goal of the whole progression and evolution and creation and sustenance of the universe is to drive the universe and humanity towards that perfected Geulah state and goal. Let me mention, by the way, another thing which I alluded to about the 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, which again are key because they're characterizing this universal consciousness reality. So within those 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, and the idea is that, I remember I told you about the universal computational formula, which again is depicted here and is also outlined in some of the scientific articles that appear as part of this book. But this universal consciousness, the universal computational formula has been expanded now recently to include the 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, which are integral parts of this universal conscious reality. And essentially the idea is that, again, it's expanding our mind, and it's a little bit mind-boggling, but we can and we should wrap our minds around this new understanding, because it gives us great insight into this. It's time for Geulah, into this Geulah state which science and humanity is entering as we speak. And we're all integral parts of this process, this wonderful, extremely hopeful, extremely gracious new phase of humanity, science and humanity. So when we start realizing that at every trillionth of a second, more than a trillionth of a trillionth, etc. of a second, the universal computational principle, or UCP or UCR, is undergoing these 10 hierarchical computational dimensions. And generally, by the way, there's two, in a sense, columns or pillars. The right pillar would be manifesting much more what is called in terms chesed in Jewish thought. That's benevolence, that's goodness, that's a sense of giving by the universal consciousness principle, reality. The left side would be much more of gvura, and that would, in a sense, imply much more measured and justice and just action. So we have these two pillars, and the 10 hierarchical computational dimensions are actually alternating between these chesed and gvura, these two primary principles. But the idea is that at every trillionth of a trillionth, etc., of a second, the universal conscious reality is computing. By the way, we said chesed, benevolence, or all goodness. It's computing for each individual human being on the planet. It's computing the precise, appropriate, or right, exact next frame or future. Remember, he said one of multiple possible futures, which then becomes the present. So it's computing for each individual human being the precisely compatible or rightful universal frame for the next minute, for the next much less than a minute, for the present, for the next present, or the future that is now being computed. It's computing at every trillionth of a second for each individual human being the correct universal frame and the correct situation in all respects, and especially in the moral sense, that would allow that human being to correct any immoral imbalances by immoral actions, or to echo and gratify and reinforce any moral actions. So at every trillionth of a second, it's undergoing many of these 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, essentially to compute what would be the best, perfect, and appropriate future, which becomes the present, of every individual human being. Again, way beyond our human understanding. But what this teaches us, and within those 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, by the way, I should highlight one of them, another principle, which is, I call it Teshuva. Teshuva in Jewish tradition, Hasidic tradition, is the ability of a human being to regret and make a change, and ask for forgiveness from the person that they've inflicted pain upon, from this universal conscious reality, i.e. God, but in a sense make a conscious decision to change our ways for the better. So if a person saw that they've inflicted pain, if they have this reflection and conscious regret, they're asking for forgiveness from a person that they've inflicted pain upon, they're asking for forgiveness from this universal conscious reality or God, and they're making a conscious choice to change their ways and not to repeat that immoral action or attitude, etc., then this then offsets and changes the universal consciousness reality's computation of one of multiple possible futures. Without this teshuva, let's say if a person inflicted pain on another human being, the corresponding one of the possible futures that would be selected for that human being would have them experience this painful situation, not as a punishment, as I've written, but as a way to rectify and raise their awareness that they've been doing something which is wrong, and really that we're all part of this one singular reality. And so see what the power of teshuva is, and see what the power of moral choice is, that we realize as we're getting closer and we're starting this era, so to speak, of Geulah. It's time for Geulah. Science is now recognizing that there's really one reality, one singular high-order reality, which is typified by all goodness, by morality, by oneness, by harmony, by peace, by striving to bring the universe and humanity towards this perfected moral, spiritual, and even physical state of Geulah. Physical, by the way, I've written one of the articles about the abolishment of death, because there is the possibility of time reversal, and that would entail the possibility of the abolishment of death. And that would be part of this Geulah perfected state, God willing. But in any event, the idea is that when we say it's time for Geulah, we're starting to realize humanity, science, and through science humanity is starting to realize the tremendous possibilities and responsibility and fortune, so to speak, or blessing for humanity and for each one of us as an individual human being when we start opening our eyes and seeing the reality, including the power of Teshuva. And perhaps this is a good place to converge, because we're in a holy day and a special day for the Jewish people and for the whole world, actually. But for the Jewish people and for Chassidut, as I said, this is a remarkable day for the Alter Rebbe and for the whole Hasidic tradition and wisdom, because this date essentially is the commemoration and the signification of the Hasidic thought, which is now converging. Science is converging with Hasidic thought. Science, the new God's physics paradigm, is realizing what Hasidut has been saying, and actually Jewish tradition has been saying for thousands of years, which is essentially there's one singular reality. This singular reality is this universal conscious reality, i.e. God in religious terms, and it's typified by all goodness, by morality, by oneness, by peace and harmony, and by wanting to and striving to bring the world into this perfected Geulah state. And so I want to mention the great Lubavitcher Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe and their teachings, which is the Lubavitcher Rebbe is urging us what science, in a sense, is also telling us now. But obviously, I want to quote this great leader, Lubavitcher Rebbe, who is telling us to open our eyes and see. Open our eyes and see the reality. And in other words, if we open our eyes and realize that the world is not material, the world is not random, the world has not been created by a Big Bang, a random nuclear event, it's not drifting into nothingness. The moral principle is a key principle. The universal conscious reality is the only reality, and that universal conscious reality is urging us and teaching us and leading us now, even through science, to open our eyes and realize there is one singular reality. Remember, we said that the world and even human beings are a transit manifestation, phenomenal manifestation of this singular, higher ordered universal conscious reality, which is really the only reality of behind the universe and transcending the universe. And so when we say it's time for Geulah, and when the great Lubavitcher Rebbe is telling us, and the Alter Rebbe is telling us to open our eyes and see and realize and be active partners in bringing about this Geulah state of the world. This is an exciting point in our personal and collective lives as scientists, as human beings for humanity. Because now we start realizing that every action that we make has a consequence, and morality and the moral principle is a key driving force in the world and in this universal consciousness reality. And it's urging us and encouraging us to open our eyes and see this reality, to be active partners and willing partners, positive partners in this Geulah state. That means, in practical terms, when we read a book such as the God's Physics book, or we listen to these lectures and read the articles, etc., and we start opening our eyes and realizing and seeing that we're all part of one reality. We're not separate individual human beings. We're actually integral parts of the one reality. And when we start acting in a moral way, in a helpful way, in a good way towards each other, when we start realizing that every trillionth of a second, this universal conscious reality is with us, is the only reality that's creating us and the whole universe. Its purpose, its whole purpose, is to bring the world and humanity and each one of us individually to the recognition of the real reality, which is all oneness, which is moral, which is all goodness, and to bring humanity to this perfected Geulah state. So today is a very exciting day. I feel very fortunate to deliver this exciting video, and I hope that this new understanding of the perfected Geulah state, and when I said it's time for Geulah, I hope that we realize, both scientists, laymen, and humanity more generally, that we're at the brink of a new era of Geulah. We can be willing partners and contribute to this much more hopeful and perfected state of the world. And so I'm very glad to present this fascinating topic and realize that we're all part of this Geulah state, perfected state. And it's a very exciting time for us individually, again, as laymen, as in scientists, and for humanity more generally. Thank you very much.